The summer heat pressed down like a heavy blanket as Private James Anderson stood at the bus station, his military duffel bag resting against his polished boots. The morning sun gleamed off his freshly pressed uniform, each badge and button telling its own story of dedication and service. After 6 months of rigorous training at Fort Benning, he was finally heading home to surprise his mother. The station buzzed with the usual morning crowd, travelers rushing to catch their buses, children clutching their mother's hands, and vendors calling out to sell their morning papers. James checked his first-class ticket one more time, a small luxury he'd allowed himself with his saved-up military pay. His mother had always taught him that hard work deserved its rewards. As he waited in line to board the Greyhound, an elderly couple in front of him chatted about their grandchildren. Behind him, a young mother tried to quiet her fussy baby, and James offered her a kind smile. These small moments of human connection made him feel good about being back in civilian spaces after months of military routine. The bus pulled up, its silver sides reflecting the Georgia sunshine. James watched as other passengers began boarding, some carrying briefcases, others lugging suitcases filled with summer vacation hopes. He adjusted his uniform collar, making sure everything was perfectly in place. His training instructor's words echoed in his mind. "Your uniform isn't just cloth and buttons, it's a symbol of our nation's values." When his turn came, James handed his ticket to the driver with a respectful "Good morning, sir." The driver, a heavy-set man with gray temples and deep-set eyes, took one look at the ticket, then at James, and his face changed. It was a change James had seen before, that supple hardening of features, the slight tightening around the mouth. "There must be some mistake," the driver said, his voice carrying just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. He held the ticket between his thumb and forefinger as if it might bite him. "First-class seating is." He paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound too obvious. "Not available for you today." James felt his heart rate quicken, but his face remained calm. 6 months of military discipline had taught him how to wear a mask of composure. He could feel eyes on him, some curious, some sympathetic, others deliberately looking away. A young boy, maybe 7 or 8, tugged at his mother's sleeve and whispered, "But Mom, he's a soldier." The morning that had started with such promise now felt heavy with familiar disappointment. James thought about his mother, about how she'd raised him to handle these moments with dignity. He thought about his fellow soldiers at Fort Benning, about the medals on his chest that apparently meant nothing here at this bus station in 1961. The ticket in his hand, purchased with money he'd earned serving his country, suddenly felt like nothing more than paper. But James stood straight, his shoulders back, just as he'd been trained. He was more than this moment, more than this driver's prejudice, more than the system trying to push him back. What James didn't notice was the quiet man in the dark suit sitting on a bench nearby, watching the scene unfold with keen interest. The man's fountain pen moved silently across the pages of a small notebook, recording every detail of what was about to become more than just another story of discrimination in the American South. The morning sun continued to climb higher in the Georgia sky, and the air grew thicker with tension. Other passengers shifted uncomfortably, forming a small gap around James and the driver, as if the confrontation had created its own gravity. This was supposed to be a simple bus ride home, but it was becoming something else entirely, a moment that would ripple out far beyond this hot summer morning at a Georgia bus station. James took a deep breath and pulled out his ticket again. His fingers weren't shaking. They never shook during moments like these anymore. "Sir," he said, keeping his voice steady and respectful, "I purchased a first-class ticket. Right here it shows seat 7A. He held the ticket where the morning light could clearly show every printed word. The bus driver's face flushed red, starting from his neck and creeping up to his ears. "Listen here," he said, lowering his voice to a harsh whisper. "I don't make the rules. Back seats are open." He jerked his thumb toward the rear of the bus, not even trying to hide his meaning anymore. A murmur rippled through the waiting passengers. Near the front of the line, an elderly white woman in a floral dress clutched her handbag tighter, as if somehow that would protect her from the tension building in the air. Behind her, a businessman pretended to be deeply absorbed in his newspaper, though his eyes hadn't moved across the page in minutes. 2 young men at the back of the line started whispering to each other, their faces showing a mix of anger and shame. One of them, wearing overalls and a work shirt, took half a step forward before his friend grabbed his arm and shook his head slightly. This wasn't their fight, but their eyes showed they knew exactly what was happening. James looked down at his uniform, at the medals that spoke of service and sacrifice. He thought about his training sergeant's words about honor and dignity. Each second felt like an hour as the Georgia sun beat down on them all, making the air thick with more than just heat. A little girl, no more than 6, tapped at her father's sleeve. "Daddy," she said in that loud whisper that children never quite master, "why can't the soldier sit in front? He's protecting us." Her father shushed her quickly, his face a mask of discomfort and something else, maybe regret. The driver's hands tightened on the ticket, crumpling it slightly at the edges. "Look," he said, his voice getting louder now, "either take a seat in the back or wait for the next bus. There's people waiting." He gestured to the line behind James, as if the other passengers were somehow being inconvenienced by this man's simple request to sit in the seat he paid for. James could feel his pulse in his temples, could hear his mother's voice in his head, telling him to hold his head high. He'd faced worse in training, faced danger and exhaustion and fear. But somehow, this moment, this simple moment of being told he wasn't good enough to sit in a seat he'd rightfully purchased, cut deeper than any physical challenge. From somewhere in the middle of the waiting crowd, someone cleared their throat. A few heads turned, but quickly looked away again. Nobody wanted to get involved, yet everyone was part of this moment whether they wanted to be or not. The man in the dark suit, still watching from his seemingly casual position, wrote something in his notebook. His pen moved deliberately, capturing every detail of the scene unfolding before him. Though he appeared to be just another passenger, his eyes held the sharp focus of someone who knew exactly what they were witnessing. James straightened his shoulders, feeling the weight of his duffel bag, the weight of his uniform, the weight of this moment. He had a choice to make, one that would echo far beyond this hot morning at a Georgia bus station. His training had taught him about strategy, about choosing your battles, about knowing when to stand your ground and when to live to fight another day. The air around them all seemed to pause, waiting to see what would happen next. Even the usual station noise, the chatter, the footsteps, the rustle of newspapers, seemed to dim, as if the world itself was holding its breath to see how this moment would play out in the ongoing story of America's struggle with itself. The man in the dark suit sat perfectly still, his leather notebook balanced carefully on his knee. He looked like any other business traveler, gray at the temples, well-pressed suit, polished shoes, but his eyes told a different story. They moved with purpose, taking in every detail of the scene unfolding before him. His pen hadn't stopped moving since the moment Private James Anderson stepped onto that bus. Each word he wrote was careful, measured, like he was painting a picture with words that would need to be crystal clear when read later. The notebook's pages were filled with observations, timestamps, exact quotes, descriptions of every person involved. From his strategic position in the middle section of the waiting area, he could see everything. He noted how the other passengers reacted, the subtle head shakes, the uncomfortable shuffling of feet, the way some couldn't meet anyone's eyes while others couldn't look away. Every reaction was a piece of the story he was carefully documenting. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple, but he didn't wipe it away. His hand remained steady as he wrote, his handwriting as crisp as when he'd started. He'd seen scenes like this play out before, in other stations, on other buses, in diners and parks across the state. But something about this one, about the soldier in his pristine uniform being denied a seat he paid for, made his jaw tighten just a bit more than usual. The businessman's suit jacket was starting to feel heavy in the Georgia heat, but he didn't remove it. Appearance mattered in his position, and he needed to maintain his cover as just another traveler. His gold wedding ring caught the sunlight as he turned another page, the soft leather of the notebook creaking slightly. He watched the driver's body language, the defensive stance, the way he held the ticket like it was something unclean, the slight tremor in his hands that betrayed his own discomfort with what he was doing. The observer had seen this before, people following unjust rules, hiding behind, "This is just how things are," while knowing deep down that something was wrong. What fascinated him most were the small acts of humanity breaking through the tension. The young mother who smiled apologetically at the soldier, the elderly man who shook his head in disapproval at the driver's behavior, the child who spoke truth with innocent clarity. These were the details that would matter later, the proof that consciousness was shifting, even here in the Deep South. His free hand absently touched the inside pocket of his suit jacket, where a small identification card rested, one that would shock everyone in this bus station if they knew who he really was. But now wasn't the time for revelations. Now was the time for watching, for documenting, for gathering the kind of evidence that could make real change happen. The observer noticed things others might miss, how the soldier's military bearing never wavered, how his dignity seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment of the confrontation. He noted the exact time, the weather conditions, the number of witnesses. Each detail could be important later, when this incident would become part of something bigger than just one man being denied a bus seat. As the tension in the station continued to build, the man in the suit remained outwardly calm, though his heart beat faster with each passing moment. He knew what he was witnessing wasn't just another incident, it was a moment that could become a catalyst for change, if handled properly. His pen moved faster now, recording every word, every gesture, every reaction that might help tell this story later. The notebook pages filled with more than just facts. They captured the human story unfolding in front of him, the silent struggle between what was legal and what was right, between old ways and necessary change. Through his careful observations, this moment wouldn't be lost to time. It would become evidence, testimony, proof of why things needed to change. Time seemed to slow down as Private James Anderson stood there, the crumpled first-class ticket still in his hand. His military training had taught him how to make split-second decisions under pressure, but this was different. This wasn't about tactics or strategy. This was about something deeper, something that touched the very core of human dignity. He thought about his mother at home, about how she'd always taught him to pick his battles wisely. Sometimes, she'd say, the strongest thing you can do is walk away with your head held high. Her voice echoed in his mind now, clear as a bell despite the humid Georgia morning air that seemed to muffle everything else. The medals on his chest felt heavier than usual. Each one represented a moment of courage, of duty fulfilled, of service to a country that still struggled to serve all its citizens equally. His fingers brushed against them briefly as he straightened his uniform, a habit born of pride and discipline. Around him, the other passengers had created a small circle of space, as if the tension radiating from this confrontation needed its own territory. Some stared at their shoes, others pretended to be deeply interested in the station's worn brick walls. But their discomfort was visible in the way they shifted their weight from foot to foot, in the nervous adjusting of collars and sleeves. A young boy, watching wide-eyed from behind his father's legs, would remember this moment decades later. He'd tell his own children about the soldier who stood straight and tall that day, about how sometimes the biggest battles are fought silently, with dignity rather than fists. James took a deep breath, feeling the starched collar of his uniform against his neck. He'd faced tougher challenges in basic training, pushed through exhaustion and fear, learned to keep his cool under pressure. Those lessons served him well now as he made his decision. Without a word, he picked up his duffel bag. The movement was smooth, controlled, every inch the trained soldier. Some might have mistaken his action for surrender, but anyone watching closely enough would have seen the strength in his posture, the unwavering determination in his eyes. As he moved toward the back of the bus, his footsteps echoed on the metal steps. Each step was deliberate, measured, like a march during parade. He wasn't being pushed to the back. He was choosing to be the bigger person, choosing to fight this battle another day, in another way. The other passengers watched his progress down the aisle, their expressions a mix of shame, relief, and something else, respect. An elderly man nodded slightly as James passed, a tiny gesture of acknowledgement. A young woman quickly wiped her eyes, trying to hide the tears that had formed. From his seat in the middle section, the man in the dark suit wrote furiously in his notebook, capturing every detail of this moment. He noted not just what was happening, but the way it was happening. The dignity, the control, the quiet strength that spoke louder than any words could have. James stowed his bag and sat down, his posture perfect, his gaze forward. He didn't slump in defeat. He sat like a soldier, like a man who knew his worth wasn't determined by where he was allowed to sit on a bus. The sunlight streaming through the window caught his medals again, making them shine. The air in the bus felt different now, heavy with unspoken words, with things that should have been said but weren't. The driver cleared his throat awkwardly and began checking other tickets, but the usual routine felt hollow somehow, as if everyone knew they were participating in something that history would judge harshly. The bus journey felt longer than usual, each mile marked by the heavy silence that had settled over the passengers. As they approached the terminal, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows. Private James Anderson hadn't moved from his upright position, his dignity intact despite the morning's humiliation. As passengers began gathering their belongings, the man in the dark suit closed his notebook with deliberate care. He'd filled several pages with his neat handwriting, documenting every detail of what he'd witnessed. Now came the moment he'd been waiting for. The bus rolled to a stop, brakes hissing like a tired sigh. People started standing up, reaching for bags, avoiding each other's eyes as they prepared to go their separate ways. The driver called out their location in a voice that seemed smaller than it had been that morning. James waited patiently for others to file out, still maintaining his military bearing. He was surprised when the man in the suit, who had been sitting quietly in the middle section, remained in his seat as well. Their eyes met briefly, and something in the older man's expression made James pause. As the last passengers stepped off, the man in the suit rose smoothly from his seat. He straightened his tie, a small, practiced gesture, and walked toward James with purposeful steps. The leather notebook was still in his hand, but now he reached into his inner jacket pocket with his free hand. "Private Anderson," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of authority despite its gentle tone. "I believe we need to have a conversation." He pulled out a small identification card, holding it so only James could see it. "I'm Governor Theodore Roosevelt McKeldin." The revelation hung in the air between them. James's eyes widened slightly, the only break in his composed expression. The governor of Maryland had been sitting on this bus, witnessing everything that had happened. "I've been conducting unofficial investigations," the governor continued, his voice still low but clear. "Riding buses, sitting in stations, watching how our citizens are treated." He opened his notebook, showing pages dense with observations. "What happened to you today? It's not just your story anymore. It's evidence." The empty bus felt suddenly smaller, more intimate, as if the metal walls were leaning in to listen. Through the windows, they could see other passengers dispersing into the terminal, unaware of the significant conversation taking place behind them. "Sir," James began, but the governor held up a hand. "You showed remarkable composure today, son," he said, genuine respect in his voice. "The way you handled yourself, that's the kind of dignity that changes minds. Changes laws eventually." He glanced down at his notebook. "I've been gathering stories like yours, building a case. But this," he paused, tapping the pages. "This was different." James stood a little straighter, if that was possible. The governor's presence, his words, gave new meaning to the morning's events. What had felt like another moment of humiliation was transforming into something else, a documented piece of history, a step toward change. "Your actions today will help others," the governor continued. "We're going to use what happened here to push for stronger enforcement of desegregation laws, starting with public transportation." He pulled out a business card, offering it to James. "I'll need your formal statement when you're ready." The late afternoon light streamed through the bus windows, catching the dust motes in its beams. Outside, life continued as usual, but inside this bus, something extraordinary was happening. A chance encounter was becoming a catalyst for change. A private indignity was becoming public evidence. In the weeks that followed, Governor McKeldin's office became a hub of quiet but intense activity. The leather notebook that had captured James's story now sat on the governor's desk, its pages joined by dozens of similar accounts. But the private story stood out. A soldier in uniform denied the simple dignity of a seat he paid for. The investigation moved forward with careful precision. The governor's team worked late into evenings, their desk lamps casting pools of light on stacks of documents. They interviewed bus drivers, station managers, and other passengers who'd witnessed similar incidents. Each conversation added another piece to the larger picture they were building. The bus company's management was called in for a series of closed-door meetings. They arrived in pressed suits and polished shoes, confident at first, but that confidence began to crack as the governor's team laid out their evidence. The notebook entries, the witness statements, the documented pattern of discrimination, it all painted a picture they couldn't easily dismiss. This isn't just about one incident, the governor explained during one particularly tense meeting. He held up the pages describing James's experience. This is about a soldier who serves our country being treated as less than a full citizen on our public transportation. His voice was calm but carried an undercurrent of steel that made the company executives shift uncomfortably in their chairs. Outside the official meetings, word spread through quiet channels. Other soldiers came forward with their own stories. Bus drivers who'd been uncomfortable with enforcing discriminatory policies began speaking up. The ripples from that hot Georgia morning spread wider and wider. The local paper ran a small story at first, just a few paragraphs about an investigation into transportation practices. But reporters started asking questions, digging deeper. They found patterns, connections, a whole system of unwritten rules that everyone followed, but nobody wanted to acknowledge openly. In his small apartment, Private James Anderson watched it all unfold with a mix of hope and caution. He'd given his formal statement as the governor requested, his words clear and precise as he described what happened. His military training showed in how he stuck to the facts, but his humanity showed in the quiet dignity with which he told his story. The governor's office kept him updated on the progress. Each letter that arrived carried news of small victories, policy changes, training requirements, enforcement measures. But more importantly, they carried a sense that his decision to handle that morning's humiliation with dignity had helped set something bigger in motion. Other changes appeared slowly but surely. Bus drivers received new training. Signs that had enforced separation began disappearing. Company policies were rewritten, this time with clear language about equal treatment for all passengers. It wasn't a revolution, it was something quieter but just as powerful, systematic change, one policy at a time. The business community took notice. Other companies started reviewing their own practices, making changes before they found themselves under similar scrutiny. It wasn't just about doing what was legally required anymore, it was about doing what was right. Through it all, the governor kept James's story as a central example of why these changes mattered. Not because it was the most dramatic incident they'd documented, but because it highlighted the absurdity of discrimination so clearly, a decorated soldier being denied a seat he paid for, all because of the color of his skin. Back at the bus station where it all began, small changes started appearing. New signs about passenger rights went up. The same driver who had denied James his seat went through mandatory retraining, and while old habits and prejudices didn't disappear overnight, there was a sense that something had shifted, that the ground had moved just a little bit closer to level. 30 years later, on a warm Sunday afternoon, Private James Anderson, now a grandfather, sat in his favorite armchair, surrounded by his grandchildren. The youngest one, barely 6, sat cross-legged on the floor, looking up at him with wide, curious eyes. "Tell us the bus story again, Grandpa," she asked, her voice eager with anticipation. James smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. The military medals from that day hung in a frame on the wall behind him, still gleaming after all these years. But now they told more than just a story of military service. They were part of a bigger story, one about dignity, change, and unexpected allies. "Well," he began, his voice warm and rich with memory, "it was a hot morning in Georgia, and I was wearing my uniform, just like the one in that picture over there." He pointed to a black and white photograph on the bookshelf, showing a young soldier standing tall and proud. "I had a first-class ticket in my hand and hope in my heart." The older grandchildren, who'd heard the story before, settled in anyway. There was something about the way their grandfather told it, not as a tale of victimhood, but as a story of dignity and change, that made them want to hear it again and again. But the most interesting part, he continued, leaning forward slightly, wasn't what happened on that bus. It was who was watching. His eyes twinkled as the children leaned in closer. "Sometimes the people who can help make things right are closer than you think, even sitting just a few seats away." He told them about Governor McKeldin, about the little notebook that documented injustice, about how one moment of maintaining dignity in the face of unfairness became part of something bigger. But he also told them about the small changes that followed, how the next time he rode that bus line, just 6 months later, he sat right up front and nobody said a word against it. The governor kept in touch over the years, James said, reaching for a folder on the side table. Inside were letters, newspaper clippings, and photographs that traced the story's impact through time. He used to say that what happened that day helped him show others why change was necessary, not just because it was right, but because it made no sense to treat any American citizen, especially a soldier, that way. The children passed the old documents around carefully, touching the yellowed papers with gentle fingers. They looked at pictures of their grandfather with the governor, at newspaper headlines about transportation reforms, at thank you letters from other soldiers who benefited from the changes that followed. "But you know what I want you all to remember most?" James asked, looking at each young face in turn. "It's not about the seat on the bus. It's about how you carry yourself when life isn't fair. It's about knowing that sometimes the quietest stand can make the loudest statement." He reached out and took his youngest grandchild's hand. "And it's about understanding that change doesn't always come with big speeches and grand gestures. Sometimes it comes because one person decides to do what's right, even when nobody's watching, or because someone you never expected turns out to be watching and decides to help." The late afternoon sun streamed through the window, casting warm light on the family gathered in the living room. On the wall, the framed medals caught the light, reminding them all that some victories aren't won on battlefields, but in quiet moments of dignity on ordinary days. "Best of all," James concluded, smiling at his grandchildren, "that change we helped start, it didn't stop with buses. It showed people that when we stand up for what's right, even if we have to sit down to do it, we can make the world a little bit better for everyone who comes after us." The children sat quietly for a moment, absorbing the story's meaning. Then the youngest spoke up again. "You were brave, Grandpa." James shook his head gently. "No, little one. I was just being who I was raised to be. Sometimes that's all the bravery we need."